Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're traveling to an island on the western edge of Europe, a place where mist rolls in from the Atlantic and history runs deeper than most realize. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. In the beginning, Ireland was silent. Not the kind of silence you find in a library or a sleeping house, but something older, something absolute. It was the silence of a world locked beneath ice, a landscape crushed under glaciers that had ground across the land for tens of thousands of years, carving valleys, gouging out lakes, reshaping the very bones of the earth. The last ice age held Ireland in its grip, and nothing moved across those frozen plains except the slow, inexorable crawl of ice itself. But ice ages, like all things, come to an end. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The great sheets that had covered northern Europe started their long retreat. Slowly, grudgingly, the ice pulled back. What it left behind was raw. The land was scraped clean, torn open, littered with boulders the size of houses that had been carried hundreds of miles and dropped wherever the ice finally melted. Rivers ran wild through valleys that hadn't existed before. The soil was thin and poor, barely covering the bedrock beneath. It was a new world, harsh and empty, waiting. For thousands of years, this barren landscape slowly came back to life. Lichens crept across the rocks. Mosses followed. Then grasses, shrubs, and eventually trees, birch and willow at first. Then pine and oak as the climate continued to warm. The forests grew thick and dark, covering the island in a canopy of green. And with the forests came animals. Deer wandered through the undergrowth. Boar rooted in the leaf litter. Birds filled the branches with their calls. The land was fertile again, alive again, but still empty of one thing: people. Ireland's first human inhabitants arrived around 8,000 years before the Common Era, roughly 10,000 years ago, in what archaeologists call the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age. These were not farmers or builders. They were hunter-gatherers, people who lived by reading the land, by knowing where the fish ran thick in the rivers, where the hazelnuts ripened in autumn, where the deer came to drink at dawn. They traveled light because they traveled often, following the seasons and the resources each season provided. In summer, they might camp along the coast, harvesting shellfish and seabirds. In autumn, they moved inland to gather nuts and hunt in the forests. Winter was hardest, a time of lean stores and careful rationing, but they survived it year after year, generation after generation. We know they were here because they left traces. Not much, but enough. Along the coasts and riverbanks, archaeologists have found the remains of their camps, circular scatters of charcoal and flint tools where fires once burned and hands once worked. At Mount Sandel in County Londonderry, excavations revealed one of the earliest settlement sites, dating back nearly 9,000 years. The post holes from circular huts still mark the ground, arranged in patterns that suggest careful planning. These were not random shelters thrown up against the night, but considered structures, built and rebuilt on the same spot across multiple seasons, suggesting that this band of hunter-gatherers returned to this favorable location year after year. The tools themselves tell a story. They're small, precise, carefully shaped. Microliths, they're called, tiny blades of flint that would have been set into wooden handles to make spears, arrows, or cutting tools. The people who made these tools understood their materials intimately. They knew which stones would flake cleanly, which angles would produce the sharpest edge, which shapes would serve which purposes. At Mount Sandel, archaeologists found thousands of these microliths, along with larger scrapers and axes, evidence of a sophisticated toolkit adapted to multiple tasks. They found the bones of wild pigs, showing these people hunted in the forests. They found fish bones, salmon especially, suggesting they knew when and where the salmon runs would occur. They found hazelnut shells by the thousands, charred from roasting, a rich source of protein and fat that could be stored through the winter. This was knowledge passed down through families, through communities, knowledge that kept them alive. Every child learned by watching, by doing, by listening to the stories of where the good flint could be found, where the deer paths crossed the streams, which plants were edible and which would kill you. This was an oral encyclopedia, constantly updated, constantly refined, as essential to survival as any tool. They built temporary shelters, simple structures of wood and hide that left almost nothing behind. The only permanent mark they made on the landscape was in the shell middens, great mounds of discarded oyster and mussel shells that accumulated over centuries at favored camping spots along the coast. These middens can still be found today, layers of ancient meals compressed into archaeological records, telling us what these people ate, where they lived, how they moved through their world. Life was seasonal and cyclical. They knew the island intimately, not as a map with borders and place names, but as a living system of relationships. They knew when the salmon would run up the rivers to spawn, when the hazelnuts would be ready for harvest, when the seals would come ashore to bear their young. They named the places they frequented, though we'll never know what those names were. They told stories around their fires, stories about the land, about the spirits that inhabited it, about where they came from and how they should live. None of those stories survived. The oral tradition of the Mesolithic left no written record, no carvings, no paintings on cave walls like those found elsewhere in Europe. What they believed, what they dreamed, what songs they sang, all of it vanished with them. But they were real. For thousands of years they lived on this island, small bands of perhaps 20 or 30 people, scattered across the landscape, meeting occasionally to trade, to find marriage partners, to share news and stories. Based on the limited archaeological evidence we have, scholars estimate the total population of Ireland during this period was probably never more than a few thousand people, maybe less. It was a sparse, scattered existence, but it was sustainable. They took what they needed and left the rest. The forests remained vast and dark. The rivers ran clear. The island was wild. Then, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, everything changed. New people arrived, or perhaps the old people learned new ways. Either way, Ireland entered the Neolithic, the new Stone Age, and nothing would ever be the same. The Neolithic revolution was not a single moment, not a day when someone planted the first seed and changed the world. It was a slow transformation that rippled across Europe over thousands of years, spreading from the Near East where agriculture first developed. By the time it reached Ireland, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, farming was already an ancient practice, refined through millennia of trial and error, success and failure, famine and plenty. The people who brought farming to Ireland may have been migrants, new settlers arriving by boat from Britain or the European continent, carrying with them bags of seed grain and knowledge of how to plant, tend, and harvest it. Or perhaps the indigenous Mesolithic people learned these techniques from contact with farming communities elsewhere and adapted them to their own use. The archaeological record doesn't give us clear answers about exactly who these first farmers were or where they came from. What it does tell us, clearly and unmistakably, is what they did. They cleared the forests. This was the first and most fundamental task, the precondition for everything that followed. The great wildwood that covered Ireland, the ancient forest of oak and elm, ash and hazel, had to come down. They used stone axes for this work, axes with polished blades that could bite deep into living wood. Recent experiments have shown that a Neolithic axe, properly sharpened and hafted, could fell a substantial tree in about 20 minutes of hard labor. But a mature oak was a different matter entirely, sometimes requiring days of work. The felling itself was just the beginning. The stumps had to be grubbed out or burned. The branches had to be cleared. The underbrush had to be dealt with. An acre of virgin forest might take a family weeks or even months to clear completely. But they had time, and they had purpose. And tree by tree, acre by acre, they opened up the land. The pollen record, preserved in bog cores sampled across Ireland, tells this story in miniature. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, the pollen profile shifts dramatically. Oak and elm pollen, which had dominated for millennia, suddenly declines. In its place comes grass pollen, plantain, and other species associated with open ground and agriculture. The forest was being pushed back systematically, replaced by a human-modified landscape. Where the forest had been, they planted fields. Wheat and barley, the foundation crops of Neolithic agriculture, grew in neat rows where wild undergrowth had once tangled. These were not the high-yielding varieties of modern grain. Neolithic wheat was smaller, tougher, less productive per acre, but it was reliable when managed properly. They sowed in spring, watched anxiously through summer, and harvested in late summer or early autumn, using flint sickles to cut the grain stalks close to the ground. The grain was threshed by beating it with wooden flails to separate the seeds from the chaff, then winnowed by tossing it in the air so the wind would blow away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain fell back down. It was labor-intensive, every step of the process. But it worked. They tended these fields through the growing season, weeding, protecting the grain from birds and deer, watching the weather with anxious eyes. A good harvest meant full bellies through the winter. A bad one meant hunger, maybe starvation. Grain could be stored in pottery vessels or in underground pits lined with stone and sealed against moisture, providing insurance against the lean months. Everything depended on those fields, on making them productive, on protecting the harvest, on building up stores that would see the community through until the next growing season. But farming gave them something the hunter-gatherers never had: surplus. In a good year, the harvest produced more grain than the community could eat. This surplus could be stored, traded, used to feed people who weren't directly involved in farming, people who could specialize in other tasks. Toolmakers, potters, builders. With agriculture came the first division of labor, the first social complexity, the first permanent settlements. They built houses now, real houses, structures meant to last. Rectangular wooden buildings with thatched roofs, walls of wattle and daub, hearths for cooking and warmth. These houses clustered together into small villages, communities of perhaps a few dozen people living side by side, sharing the work of farming, sharing the risks and the rewards. For the first time in Ireland's human history, people had permanent addresses. They belonged to a place, and that place belonged to them. The animals came with the crops. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, all of them domesticated species brought to Ireland by the first farmers. These animals transformed the landscape as thoroughly as the grain fields did. They needed pasture, and pasture meant more forest clearing. They needed tending, protection from predators, shelter in winter. The rhythms of life became tied to the needs of the herd as much as to the seasons of planting and harvest. Nowhere is the scale and sophistication of Neolithic Irish agriculture more evident than at the Caid Fields in County Mayo, on the wild northwestern coast where the Atlantic winds blow in cold and relentless. Today, these fields lie buried beneath a blanket of peat bog, preserved in the oxygen-starved darkness for 5,000 years. But when they were discovered in the 1930s, when farmers cutting turf for fuel noticed stones aligned in patterns beneath the bog surface, archaeologists realized they were looking at something extraordinary. The Caida Fields are not a single farm, but an entire landscape. A system of fields and walls stretching across thousands of acres. Stone walls, built without mortar, divide the land into rectangular plots, each plot designed for specific purposes. Some for growing crops, some for pasturing cattle, some perhaps left as meadow for hay. The walls are straight and purposeful, laid out according to a plan, evidence of surveying, of collective decision-making, of a community working together toward common goals. This was not subsistence farming, scratched out by desperate families on the edge of survival. This was organized agriculture on a scale that required planning, coordination, and surplus labor. It required a society that could mobilize its members for large, collective projects. A society with leadership, with agreed-upon rules about land use and ownership, with the stability and resources to think not just about the next harvest, but about generations to come. The climate was different then. Mayo was warmer, the growing season longer. The fields were productive, the community prosperous. But the bog tells a darker story too. Over centuries, the climate changed. It grew wetter, colder. The soil became waterlogged. Peat began to form slowly, inexorably, creeping across the fields, drowning them centimetre by centimetre. The farmers fought it for a while, building drainage ditches, moving to higher ground, but eventually they abandoned the fields altogether. The bog claimed everything, burying 5,000 years of human effort beneath a shroud of sodden vegetation. But the bog also preserved what it buried. When modern archaeologists excavate at Said, they find the fields exactly as they were left. The stones still in place, the walls still defining boundaries that no one had walked for millennia. They find the pollen preserved in the peat layers, telling them what plants grew when, how the climate changed, when the forest was cleared, and when it began to return. They find the story of a people who transformed their world, who built something that lasted, who adapted and persisted until the land itself defeated them. Elsewhere in Ireland, other Neolithic communities were doing similar work, clearing fields, building homes, establishing territories. The population grew. By the height of the Neolithic, there may have been hundreds of thousands of people living on the island, a population density that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. Villages spread across the best farmland, along river valleys, in the fertile lowlands. The wilderness was retreating, and with this new way of life came new ways of thinking about the world, about life and death, about the cosmos and humanity's place in it. The Neolithic people of Ireland began to build monuments, structures that would outlast their builders by millennia, structures that still stand today as testament to their vision and their labor. When you walk up to Newgrange on a cold morning, the first thing that strikes you is its presence. This is not a ruin. Despite being older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, older than any cathedral or castle, Newgrange does not feel ancient in the way we usually understand that word. It feels deliberate, massive, purposeful. A great mound of earth and stone, 200 feet across and 40 feet high, its face covered in brilliant white quartz stones that catch the light and throw it back, gleaming like a beacon across the Boyne Valley. This monument was built around 5,200 years ago, during the height of the Neolithic period, by people who had no written language, no metal tools, no wheels or pulleys, or any of the machinery we associate with monumental construction. They had stone, wood, and muscle. They had knowledge passed down through generations, and they had a vision of something that needed to exist, something worth the labor of hundreds of people over decades. The construction itself was a feat of organization and engineering that still impresses modern architects. The stones that form Newgrange's curb, the ring of massive slabs that circle the base of the mound, weigh up to 10 tons each. They were quarried miles away and transported to the site, probably by a combination of sledges, rollers, and sheer determination. 97 of these curbstones encircle the monument, and many of them are decorated with intricate spiral patterns, lozenges, and concentric circles, carved with patient precision using only stone tools. The entrance to Newgrange is marked by the most elaborately decorated stone of all, a massive slab covered in spirals that seem to draw the eye inward, deeper into the darkness beyond. Above the entrance is a curious feature, a rectangular opening, carefully constructed, framed in stone. This is the roof box, and its purpose would not be understood until 1967. The passage inside is narrow and low, forcing visitors to stoop as they move deeper into the heart of the mound. The walls are made of large stones, fitted together without mortar, but so precisely that water cannot penetrate them, even after 5 millennia. The ceiling is formed by massive capstones, some weighing over 20 tons, laid across the passage and supporting the weight of the entire mound above. How these stones were lifted into place remains a matter of speculation and admiration. The passage runs for 60 feet into the mound, leading to a central chamber with 3 recesses branching off like the petals of a flower. These recesses contain large stone basins, shallow bowls carved from single blocks of stone. When the monument was excavated, these basins contained cremated human remains, the ashes of the dead, placed here with care and ceremony sometime in the distant past. But Newgrange is not simply a tomb. Or rather, it is a tomb, but it is also something more, something that speaks to a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos, of the cycles of time, of the relationship between earth and sky. This became clear on the morning of December 21st, 1967, when archaeologist Michael O'Kelly, who had been excavating and restoring the site for years, decided to spend the winter solstice inside the monument to test a theory. The theory was based on that curious opening above the entrance, the roof box. O'Kelly suspected it had been designed to allow light to enter the passage at a specific time. So, on the shortest day of the year, he positioned himself inside the central chamber before dawn and waited. At precisely 8:58 in the morning, as the sun crept above the horizon, a shaft of light lanced through the roof box and began to penetrate the passage. For 17 minutes, as the sun climbed, the light traveled down the passage, illuminating the darkness, reaching all the way to the back wall of the central chamber, touching the stone basin where the ashes of the dead lay. Then, as the sun rose higher, the angle changed and the light withdrew, leaving the chamber in darkness again. This alignment is not an accident. The roof box was built at precisely the correct height and angle to capture the winter solstice sunrise and direct its light down the passage. The entire monument was oriented to this moment, planned around it, constructed to capture a single event that happens once a year, an event that marks the turning point of the year, the moment when the sun stops its retreat southward and begins its return, bringing with it the promise of spring, of warmth, of renewed life. Think about what this required. The builders needed to understand the movements of the sun, to track its position on the horizon throughout the year, to identify the exact point where it rises on the winter solstice. This was not casual observation, but systematic astronomy, requiring years of patient watching, marking, recording. They would have needed to establish a baseline observation point and track the sunrise position day by day through a full year, noting when it reached its furthest southern point. They needed to survey the site, to establish the correct alignment, to construct the passage and the roof box with sufficient precision that the light would enter exactly as planned. 5,000 years later, even after the landscape around it had changed. Modern surveyors, with all their instruments and mathematical tables, are impressed by the accuracy achieved. The alignment is accurate to within a degree, a remarkable achievement for people working with nothing more sophisticated than ropes, stakes, and sighting along lines of stretched cord. This was not primitive superstition. This was astronomy, engineering, and mathematics, executed with tools we would consider impossibly crude, but with results that speak for themselves. The knowledge required to plan and execute such a structure suggests a class of specialists, people whose role in society was to observe the skies, to understand the patterns, to translate that understanding into practical construction. While we have no direct evidence of their identity, these may well have been the ancestors of the druids, the keepers of cosmic knowledge, the intermediaries between earth and sky that later Irish tradition would remember. What did it mean to them, this moment of light penetrating the darkness? We can only speculate, but the symbolism seems clear enough. The winter solstice was the darkest time, the time when the sun was furthest away, when the world was cold and the growing season was a distant memory. But it was also the turning point, the moment of hope, when the light began its return. By bringing that moment of transformation into the heart of their monument, by allowing the light to touch the remains of their dead, the evidence suggests they may have been affirming a belief in renewal, in the continuation of life beyond death, in cycles that turn forever, dark to light, death to rebirth, winter to spring. While we cannot know their exact beliefs with certainty, the care and precision with which they constructed this alignment points toward a sophisticated cosmology that linked the movements of the heavens with the journey of the soul. Newgrange was not built in isolation. The Boyne Valley contains dozens of similar monuments, though none quite as large or as perfectly preserved. Noath and Douth, two other great passage tombs, stand nearby, each with their own passages, their own chambers, their own decorated stones. Smaller tombs dot the landscape, creating a sacred geography, a valley of the dead, where communities came to bury their ancestors, to perform rituals, to connect with forces larger than themselves. The effort required to build these monuments was immense. Recent estimates suggest that Newgrange alone would have required the labor of 300 people working for 20 years, or some equivalent combination of workers and time. This represents a staggering investment of resources for a Neolithic community. Food had to be produced to feed the workers. Tools had to be made and replaced as they wore out or broke. Materials had to be quarried, transported, shaped. The project had to be organized, coordinated, led. What kind of society could mobilize this kind of effort? Not a simple collection of independent farming families. That much is clear. These monuments required social stratification, leadership, probably some form of religious or political authority, capable of convincing or compelling people to contribute their labor to projects that would take decades to complete, projects they might not live to see finished. Someone had to hold the vision, to maintain the plan, to ensure that the work continued generation after generation. And they built them all over Ireland, not just in the Boyne Valley, but across the island. Court tombs, portal tombs, wedge tombs, each type with its own architectural style, its own regional distribution, its own purposes. Some were clearly communal burial places, used by communities over many generations. Others seem to have been built for individuals or small family groups. All of them represented statements carved into the landscape, markers of territory, of identity, of connection to place. The Bronze Age that followed continued this tradition of monumental building, but shifted its focus. As metal became available, as copper and tin were discovered and smelted and alloyed into bronze, the technology of Ireland changed. And with it, the island's connection to the wider world grew stronger. Bronze requires both copper and tin, and while Ireland had copper in abundance, especially in the southwest, where mines like Mount Gabriel show evidence of ancient working, tin was scarce. It had to be imported, probably from Cornwall in Britain, or from sources even further afield. This meant trade, long-distance trade, networks of exchange that connected Ireland to Britain, to the Atlantic coast of Europe, to the Mediterranean world beyond. Irish craftsmen became skilled metalworkers. They produced axes, swords, spearheads, and ornaments of remarkable quality. But perhaps their finest work was in gold. Ireland's rivers carried gold, nuggets and flakes washed down from mountain sources, and Bronze Age smiths learned to work this gold into objects of stunning beauty. Lunulae, crescent-shaped collars worn around the neck, were beaten from single sheets of gold, decorated with intricate geometric patterns, light as breath and brilliant as the sun. These objects were not merely valuable. They were sacred, symbols of power and prestige, and they were traded far beyond Ireland's shores. Gold lunulae and other Irish Bronze Age metalwork have been found across Europe, from Britain to the Mediterranean, from France to Germany. These objects tell us that Ireland was not isolated, not a backwater on the edge of the known world, but part of a vast network of exchange. A network that moved not just objects, but ideas, technologies, beliefs. Irish bronze workers learned techniques from continental smiths and developed innovations of their own. The island's metal goods were prized abroad, bringing wealth, bringing status, bringing Ireland into the broader story of Bronze Age Europe. But even as trade flourished and technology advanced, the monuments remained. Newgrange and its siblings stood silent on their hills, no longer being built, perhaps no longer fully understood by the people who lived near them, but still commanding respect, still marking the landscape, still holding their secrets. The light still entered on the winter solstice, whether anyone was there to see it or not. Around 500 years before the Common Era, a new chapter began in Ireland's story, though precisely when and how it started remains one of the enduring mysteries of Irish archaeology. This was the arrival, or perhaps the development, of Celtic culture, the tradition that would define Ireland for the next 2,000 years and beyond, that would shape its language, its art, its social structures, its very identity. The term Celtic is slippery, harder to pin down than most people realize. In continental Europe, the Celts were a diverse group of peoples who shared certain cultural characteristics. Similar languages from the Indo-European family, distinctive art styles featuring intricate spirals and interlaced patterns, particular forms of social organization and warfare. By the time of the Roman Empire, Celtic peoples occupied much of Western and Central Europe, from Spain to Turkey, from northern Italy to the British Isles. But how Celtic culture reached Ireland is unclear. There is no archaeological evidence of a massive invasion or migration around 500 before the Common Era. No sudden replacement of one population by another. Instead, what seems to have happened is a gradual cultural transformation, perhaps driven by trade contacts, by the movement of small groups of people, by the adoption of new technologies and new ideas by indigenous populations. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in Ireland was not marked by dramatic upheaval, but by slow, steady change. Iron changed warfare. Unlike bronze, which required careful alloying of copper and tin, iron could be smelted from bog iron ore, a resource Ireland had in abundance. Iron was harder than bronze, held a better edge, and was far more common. Weapons made of iron were superior to their bronze predecessors, and the warriors who wielded them had a decisive advantage in combat. This shift in technology coincided with, and perhaps drove, significant changes in Irish society. The Ireland that emerged during the Iron Age was politically fragmented, divided into dozens, perhaps over 100, small kingdoms called tuatha. Each tuath was an independent political unit, ruled by a king, or ri, who governed with the advice of nobles and druids. The population of a tuath might have been only a few thousand people, occupying an area of a few hundred square miles. These were not large territories, but within their boundaries, the Rai held absolute authority, or at least was supposed to. The tuatha were not isolated from each other. They formed complex webs of alliance and rivalry, of tribute and subordination. A powerful king might establish dominance over several neighboring tuatha, becoming an overking, a ruiri, to whom lesser kings owed allegiance and tribute. The mechanisms of this dominance varied. Sometimes it was established through conquest, through a series of successful raids and battles that demonstrated military superiority. Sometimes it was established through clever alliances, through strategic marriages that bound families together, through the manipulation of ancient claims of precedence. And above the overkings, in theory at least, there sometimes emerged provincial kings who claimed authority over entire regions. Munster, Leinster, Connaught, Ulster, and sometimes even a high king at Tara, who claimed, though rarely exercised, authority over the entire island. But these hierarchies were fluid, constantly shifting as kings rose and fell, as alliances broke and reformed, as warfare and succession disputes reshuffled the political landscape generation after generation. A tuath that was tributary to one overlord this year might shift its allegiance to a rival next year. A king who seemed powerful and secure might find himself overthrown by a cousin or nephew with a better claim to legitimacy or a more effective military following. The system was inherently unstable, which is why Irish political history before the Norman invasion reads like an endless cycle of raids, battles, betrayals, and short-lived supremacies. The warfare itself, while endemic, followed certain patterns and rules. Full-scale battles were relatively rare, too costly in terms of casualties for small kingdoms to sustain frequently. Instead, most military activity took the form of raids, quick strikes into neighboring territory to capture cattle, to burn farms, to demonstrate power and courage. These raids were conducted according to elaborate customs. They were typically announced in advance, giving the defender time to prepare, to move their valuables, to muster their warriors. The combat itself was as much ritual as military necessity, with champions challenging each other to single combat, with poets composing verses praising the brave and mocking the cowardly, with druids interceding to prevent excessive slaughter. But this ritualized warfare could still be brutal and deadly. The early Irish law texts prescribed detailed compensations for injuries sustained in battle, suggesting that wounds were common. The heroic literature is filled with descriptions of combat, of heads taken as trophies, of warriors dying gloriously or ignominiously. And occasionally, when tensions escalated or when powerful kings sought to expand their dominion, the ritualized raiding gave way to campaigns of conquest and devastation that could depopulate entire regions. This chronic fragmentation was both Ireland's strength and its weakness. On one hand, it meant that political power was distributed, that local communities maintained significant autonomy, that there was no central authority that could be conquered and controlled by outsiders. No foreign army could conquer Ireland by taking a single capital, because there was no single capital to take. On the other hand, it meant that Ireland could never unify its defences, never marshal its full strength against external threats, never speak with one voice in negotiations with more powerful neighbours. The kings built strongholds, not castles of stone, but hill forts, great earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, encircling strategic hilltops. The most impressive of these, like the Hill of Tara in County Meath or Dún Éileann in County Kildare, were not primarily military installations, but ceremonial centres, places where kings were inaugurated, where assemblies met, where the druids performed rituals that bound the king to the land and the land to the people. Warfare was endemic but limited in scale. Raids were common, cattle raids especially, since cattle were the primary form of wealth and status in Iron Age Ireland. A successful raid brought prestige to the warriors involved and enrichment to their king. A failed raid brought shame and sometimes death. Much of early Irish literature, preserved in manuscripts written centuries later by Christian monks, revolves around these cattle raids, depicting a world of heroic combat, elaborate codes of honor, and supernatural intervention in human affairs. The most famous of these stories is the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, which tells of Queen Medb of Connaught, who launches a massive invasion of Ulster to capture a legendary brown bull, setting off a war that involves hundreds of warriors and the intervention of gods and curses. The hero of the tale is Cú Chulainn, a warrior of superhuman strength and battle fury who single-handedly defends Ulster against Medb's army. Like most early Irish literature, the Táin blends history, mythology, and propaganda into a story that reveals as much about the values of the society that told it as about any actual historical events it might preserve. The society depicted in these tales is intensely hierarchical, but not in the ways we might expect. Status was determined not just by birth, but by honor, by reputation earned through combat, through generosity, through adherence to complex codes of behavior. A king was obligated to be generous to his followers, to feast them, to reward them with gifts, to lead them in battle. A warrior was obligated to be loyal to his king, to fight bravely, to seek glory. A poet was obligated to praise the worthy and satirize the unworthy. And his satire was feared because it carried magical power, capable of raising boils on the face of the satirized, or even causing death. Women in this society occupied a complex position. They could own property, could divorce, could become druids or poets. Some legendary figures like Queen Medb herself wielded political and military power. But everyday legal texts suggest that most women were subject to male authority, their legal status tied to their fathers or husbands. The reality, as always, was probably more nuanced than either the heroic tales or the legal codes suggest. The landscape of Iron Age Ireland was one of scattered farmsteads and small settlements, not towns. Each family lived on their own plot of land, farming, raising cattle, producing most of what they needed themselves. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, bronze workers, carpenters, weavers worked either independently or as clients attached to powerful patrons. Trade existed but was limited, mostly local exchanges of goods and services. The few imports that reached Ireland, Mediterranean wine, Roman coins, exotic ornaments, were luxury items controlled by the elite. This was the world into which Christianity would eventually come, a world of druids and kings, of sacred groves and hill forts, of oral tradition and intricate law. But before we can understand that transformation, we need to look more closely at the pre-Christian religious and intellectual traditions that Christianity would both challenge and, in some ways, absorb. If you had walked through Ireland 1,500 years ago, before Christianity had fully established itself, before the monasteries rose and the druids faded, you would have encountered a world utterly unlike anything we know today. Not because the landscape was so different, though it was wilder, more forested, less touched by human hands, but because the way people understood that landscape, the stories they told about it, the forces they believed inhabited it, were rooted in a worldview we can barely reconstruct. The Druids were at the center of this worldview. They were not priests in the sense we usually understand that term, not specialists in doctrine or theology. They were instead repositories of knowledge, masters of an oral tradition that encompassed law, history, poetry, astronomy, medicine, and what we might call magic, though that word carries connotations they would not have recognized. A druid's training was said to take 20 years, during which time the aspiring druid would memorize vast amounts of material, learning by rote the genealogies of kings, the precedents of legal cases, the proper forms for rituals, the sacred calendar of festivals and prohibitions. Why memorize rather than write? Writing existed. The Romans had brought their alphabet to nearby Britain, and Irish druids would have known of it. But they deliberately chose not to use it for their sacred knowledge. Some scholars believe this was because they viewed writing as diminishing, as fixing in place knowledge that should be living, flexible, adapted to each context and each telling. Others suggest it was a form of control, a way to maintain the Druids' monopoly on knowledge by ensuring that only those who underwent the long training could access it. Whatever the reason, the result was that most of what the Druids knew died with them when their tradition collapsed in the face of Christianity. What we know about pre-Christian Irish religion comes from three sources, all problematic. First, there are the accounts written by Roman observers like Julius Caesar, who describe the Druids of Gaul in some detail, but these accounts are filtered through Roman assumptions and Roman agendas. Second, there are the early Irish law texts and literary tales, but these were written down by Christian monks centuries after the pagan period, and they inevitably reflect Christian editing and interpretation. Third, there is archaeology, which can tell us where people built monuments and deposited offerings, but cannot tell us what they believed or why. From these fragmentary sources, we can piece together a rough picture. The Irish worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, though the line between divinity and heroic ancestor was often blurred. The Dagda, the good god, was a figure of abundance and power, associated with a magical cauldron that never ran empty, and a club so massive it had to be carried on wheels, a club that could kill with one end and restore life with the other. The Morrigan was a goddess of war and fate, appearing sometimes as a beautiful woman, sometimes as a crow on the battlefield, presaging death, washing the armor and weapons of those doomed to fall in an upcoming battle. Lu was a god of many skills, master of all crafts, equally adept at warfare, poetry, metalworking, and music, and his festival, Lugnasad, marked the beginning of harvest season in early August. Brigid, goddess of poetry, healing, and smithcraft, was so important that she survived the transition to Christianity, becoming Saint Brigid, whose feast day still falls on the old pagan festival of Imbolc. But these deities were not worshipped in temples, at least not in the architectural sense we usually understand. Unlike the Greeks and Romans with their elaborate temple complexes, with marble columns and bronze statues, the Irish apparently conducted their religious observances in natural settings. Sacred groves, clearings in the forest where ancient trees grew, where the boundary between the human world and the other world grew thin, where the air itself seemed charged with presence. These groves were carefully maintained, protected, their locations kept secret from the uninitiated. To damage such a grove was an offense that could bring down divine wrath on entire communities. Holy wells were another focus of veneration. Ireland is a land of springs and streams, and certain wells were believed to have healing properties or to offer visions of the future. People would visit these wells at specific times of year, particularly at the seasonal festivals, leaving offerings, scraps of cloth tied to nearby trees, small metal objects, sometimes weapons or jewelry, thrown into the water as gifts to the spirits dwelling there. Many of these wells retained their sacred character even after Christianity arrived, simply being rededicated to Christian saints, their pagan associations overlaid but not entirely erased. Hilltops where the sunrise on particular days marked significant moments in the ritual calendar were also sacred. The Hill of Tara, the Hill of Uisneach in County Westmeath, believed to be the centre of Ireland. These and countless other prominent hills were sites where communities gathered for seasonal festivals, where kings were inaugurated, where the druids performed rituals that bound the king to the land and the land to the people. These rituals were not merely symbolic. The king was literally married to the land, to the sovereignty goddess who embodied the kingdom, and his fitness to rule was demonstrated by the land's prosperity. A good king brought good harvests, healthy livestock, victory in battle. A bad king brought famine, disease, defeat. The druids could and did depose kings who failed in their sacred duties. The calendar itself was structured around 4 major festivals, each marking a crucial transition in the agricultural year. Samhain, at the end of October, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, a time when the boundary between the living and the dead was most permeable, when spirits walked and the future could be glimpsed. Imbolc, at the beginning of February, marked the first stirrings of spring, associated with the goddess Brigid and with the lactation of ewes. Bealtaine, at the beginning of May, celebrated the full arrival of summer, a time of fertility and growth, marked by bonfires and rituals to protect livestock. Lugnasad, in early August, gave thanks for the first fruits of harvest and honoured Lugh through games and competitions. These festivals were not mere symbolic observances. They were essential to the community's well-being, moments when the proper rituals had to be performed, the proper offerings made, or disaster might follow. A king who failed to observe the proper taboos associated with his office, who violated the geasa, the sacred prohibitions that defined his role, might bring famine or defeat upon his people. The other world, the realm of the gods and the dead, was not far away. It was not heaven or hell, but a parallel world that could be accessed through certain places at certain times. Sid mounds, the ancient burial mounds like Newgrange, were believed to be entrances to this other world, dwellings of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who had once ruled Ireland but had retreated underground when mortal men took dominance. On Samoin especially, these mounds might open, and the beings within might emerge, sometimes bringing blessings, sometimes demanding tribute, always dangerous to encounter. The only form of writing that pre-Christian Ireland developed was Ogham, a script unlike any other. Ogham characters are formed by notches and lines cut along the edge of a stone, usually a standing stone placed at a burial site or boundary marker. Each character represents a letter, and the letters spell out names, usually the name of the person commemorated by the stone and their lineage. X, son of Y of the tribe Zed. Simple, formulaic, but permanent. Several hundred Ogham stones survive, mostly in the southwestern counties of Kerry and Cork, though they're found scattered across Ireland and into Wales and Scotland. They date from roughly the 4th to 7th centuries, the transition period when Christianity was beginning to establish itself, but pagan traditions were still strong. Reading them requires knowledge of Old Irish and patience, as the weathering of 15 centuries has erased many of the inscriptions entirely. What's notable about Ogham is what it wasn't used for. It wasn't used for literature, for law codes, for historical chronicles, for any of the things that writing is usually employed for. It was used only for these brief commemorations, these markers that said, this person existed, this person mattered, remember. Everything else, all the vast store of Irish knowledge, remained oral. The druids kept that knowledge, and they kept power. They advised kings, they judged legal disputes, they performed the rituals that ensured the fertility of the land and the success of the community. But their power was not absolute. They did not rule kingdoms, did not command armies. A king who ignored druidic advice did so at his peril, but kings did it nonetheless when their political interests demanded. And then Christianity arrived, and the druids' world began to crumble. The story of how Christianity came to Ireland is murky, wrapped in legend and hagiography, difficult to separate from the myths that grew up around it. The traditional narrative centers on Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, whose life is known primarily through two documents he himself wrote: his confession and his letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. These are the only authentic 5th century voices we have from Ireland, and they tell a story that is both more human and more ambiguous than the later legends suggest. Patrick was not Irish. He was born somewhere in Roman Britain, probably around 400 or so, into a family of modest status. His father was a deacon, his grandfather a priest, though Patrick himself admits he was not particularly devout in his youth. When he was about 16, Irish raiders attacked his family's estate, captured him, and brought him back to Ireland as a slave. He spent 6 years in captivity, probably in the northwest, tending sheep, cold, lonely, frightened. During those years, he turned to prayer. His confession describes how he would pray 100 times a day and almost as many at night, standing in snow and ice and rain, finding in his faith a strength that sustained him through his ordeal. Eventually, he escaped, walked 200 miles to the coast, convinced a ship's captain to take him aboard, and after a difficult journey, made his way back to Britain. He could have stayed there, safe, free, surrounded by family. But he had a vision. He saw a man named Victoricus coming from Ireland with countless letters, and when he read them, they all began with the same plea. "We beg you, holy boy, to come and walk among us once more." Whether this was a genuine mystical experience or a psychological processing of trauma and guilt, it changed his life. He decided to return to Ireland, not as a slave, but as a missionary, to bring Christianity to the people who had enslaved him. He received some clerical training, though he always felt his education was inadequate, and eventually he was ordained a bishop and sent to Ireland, probably in the 430s or 440s. The details of his mission are sparse. He does not tell us where exactly he worked, though tradition places him mainly in the north and west. He does not describe his methods, though he clearly traveled extensively, baptized thousands, ordained priests, established communities. He faced opposition from both the Irish, who saw him as a threat to their traditional religion, and from British clergy who questioned his fitness for the episcopacy. He endured it all with a stubborn determination that leaps off the page of his confession. But Patrick was not the first Christian missionary to Ireland. There were Christian communities on the island before he arrived, possibly established by British Christians fleeing troubles at home, or by Irish people who had converted abroad and returned. In 431, the Pope sent a bishop named Palladius to minister to the Irish who believe in Christ, suggesting an established Christian presence. Palladius's mission apparently failed. He died or returned within a year, but it demonstrates that Christianity's roots in Ireland predate Patrick's arrival. What Patrick and the missionaries who came with and after him accomplished was not a sudden conversion, but a slow transformation that took centuries to complete. Christianity did not sweep away the old religion overnight. Instead, it adapted to it, absorbed elements of it, found ways to make itself comprehensible and acceptable to a culture steeped in druidic tradition. The key to this transformation was the monastery. Unlike continental Christianity, which was organized around bishops governing territorial dioceses from urban centers, Irish Christianity became monastic, organized around religious communities led by abbots, often located in remote areas far from any towns, for the simple reason that Ireland had no towns. The monasteries became centers of learning, of craftsmanship, of agricultural innovation, and crucially, of cultural preservation. Irish monks learned Latin, the language of the church and of learning throughout Western Europe. But they also learned to write their own language, Old Irish, and they used their literacy to record the oral traditions that the druids had guarded so jealously. Epic tales, genealogies, law codes, poetry, all of it was written down, translated from the oral into the written, from the fleeting into the permanent. This was a revolutionary act, preserving a cultural heritage that would otherwise have vanished. But the monks were not neutral recorders. They were Christians, and they edited what they preserved, sometimes subtly, sometimes obviously. Pagan gods became historical kings, or were demonized as evil spirits. References to druidic rituals were modified or removed. Christian themes were woven into ancient stories. The result is that what we have is not pure pre-Christian tradition, but a hybrid, a synthesis of pagan and Christian, oral and literate, Irish and Latin. The monasteries became famous for their scholarship. In an age when continental Europe was convulsed by barbarian invasions and the collapse of Roman authority, when learning was in retreat and libraries were being destroyed, Ireland became a refuge for knowledge. Monks copied classical texts, studied grammar and rhetoric, debated theology. They developed a distinctive artistic style, combining Celtic spirals and interlaced patterns with Christian iconography, creating illuminated manuscripts that are among the masterpieces of medieval art. The greatest of these is the Book of Kells, created around 800 in one of Ireland's premier monasteries, possibly Iona in Scotland, or Kells itself in County Meath. The Book of Kells is a gospel book containing the 4 Gospels in Latin, but it is not merely a text. It is a work of art, every page decorated with intricate patterns. Fantastical creatures, human figures in impossible poses, all rendered in brilliant colors that still glow after 12 centuries. The Chai Row page, which marks the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, is so densely decorated that new details emerge every time you look at it. Spirals within spirals, patterns within patterns. A visual representation of infinity compressed into a single page. Creating such a manuscript required years of work, dozens of skilled artists, expensive materials, gold leaf and pigments imported from across Europe and beyond. It was an investment of staggering proportions, and the fact that it was made at all tells us something about the wealth and cultural priorities of the Irish monasteries at their height. But the monasteries did not just preserve and create, they also sent out. Irish monks became missionaries, traveling to Britain, to continental Europe, founding new monasteries, converting pagans, copying texts, teaching. Columba established a monastery on the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland, which became a centre of learning and missionary activity. Columbanus travelled to France and Italy, founding monasteries that would endure for centuries. These Irish peregrini, wanderers for Christ, carried Irish learning and Irish spirituality across Europe at a time when both were desperately needed. This was Ireland's golden age, roughly from the 6th to the 9th centuries, when the island was peaceful, prosperous, culturally vibrant. The monasteries accumulated wealth through land grants and donations, becoming powerful institutions in their own right, sometimes rivaling the secular kings in influence. The illuminated manuscripts, the stone high crosses carved with biblical scenes, the round towers that still dot the Irish landscape, all date from this period. All testify to a society that had found a way to blend its ancient traditions with its new faith, creating something unique. But golden ages never last. As the 9th century dawned, a new threat appeared on the horizon, arriving in longships from the north, bringing fire and sword and a hunger for plunder. The Vikings had found Ireland. The first Viking raid on Ireland came in 795, just a year after the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in England that marked the beginning of the Viking Age. Irish monks, working in their scriptoriums or tending their fields, suddenly found themselves facing warriors unlike any they had encountered before. These Northmen came from the sea in swift, sleek ships, struck without warning, and vanished before any defense could be organized. They were not interested in land or conversion or political alliances. They wanted portable wealth, silver, gold, precious objects, and slaves. The monasteries, with their accumulated treasures and their isolated locations, were perfect targets. Iona, the monastery founded by Columba, was raided 3 times in the early 900s. Skellig Michael, that improbable monastery perched on a rock, rising sheer from the Atlantic, was attacked. Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Armagh, all the great centres of Irish learning and piety, all felt the Vikings' fury. The raiders carried off church plate, jewelled relics, illuminated manuscripts if they thought they could sell them, burning what they didn't take. They captured monks and nuns, loading them into their ships to be sold in slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The Irish called them the Gaul, the foreigners, or more specifically, the Finn Gael, the white foreigners, when they came from Norway, and the Dufgal, the dark foreigners, when they came from Denmark. To the monks recording these events, they were instruments of God's wrath, punishment for the sins of the Irish people. To the ordinary people suffering through raid after raid, they were simply terror. But the Viking impact on Ireland was not limited to raiding. Around 840, the nature of the Viking presence began to change. Instead of seasonal raids, they began to overwinter in Ireland, building fortified camps called long forts. These camps, initially just defensive positions, where the Vikings could safely anchor their ships and store their plunder, gradually evolved into permanent settlements. The most important of these was Dublin, founded around 841 at the ford of the River Liffey. Dublin, which comes from the Irish Dup Linn, meaning black pool, became the first true town in Ireland, a radical innovation in a country that had never developed urban centres. The Vikings brought with them urban skills, organised trade, currency-based economy, specialised craftsmen working in dedicated quarters of the town. They built wharfs and warehouses, streets and houses, creating a bustling port that connected Ireland to the wider Viking world, to York and Bristol, to Iceland and Scandinavia, to the trade routes that stretched all the way to Baghdad. Other towns followed: Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, all founded by Vikings, all growing into important commercial centres. These towns became magnets for trade, pulling Irish goods, hides, wool, agricultural produce, slaves captured in raids, into international commerce and bringing foreign goods, wine from France, silks from the Mediterranean, silver from the Islamic world, amber from the Baltic, into Ireland. The archaeological evidence from Dublin's excavations, particularly the digs at Wood Quay in the 1970s and 80s, reveals a bustling medieval town with specialised craftsmen working in dedicated quarters. There were streets of houses, timber structures with wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, sometimes 2 stories high. There were workshops where smiths forged iron and bronze, where leather workers crafted shoes and belts, where woodworkers carved combs and bowls, where jewelers worked silver and gold into elaborate brooches and arm rings. The Viking towns used currency, silver pennies minted in Dublin itself, marked with the name of the ruling king. This was revolutionary for Ireland, which had previously operated on a barter economy, supplemented by the use of standardized objects like cattle or gold rings as measures of value. Now merchants could buy and sell using coins, could accumulate portable wealth, could participate in international trade networks that stretched from Iceland to Constantinople. Irish kings, seeing the advantages, began to mint their own coins, though the practice never became as widespread in Ireland as in England or on the continent. For the first time, Ireland had a monetary economy supplementing the older system of barter and cattle-based wealth. This transformation was profound, changing not just how commerce worked, but how society organized itself. Wealth no longer needed to be kept in herds that required constant tending and protection. It could be stored as silver, hidden, accumulated, passed down through generations. This made possible a new class of merchant traders who operated independently of the old, tribal structures, who owed their wealth and status to commerce rather than kinship or military prowess. The relationship between the Vikings and the Irish was complex and evolved over time. Initially, it was pure hostility, raiders and victims. But as the Vikings settled, as generations passed, intermarriage became common. Norse warriors took Irish wives. Norse traders formed partnerships with Irish clients. Some Vikings converted to Christianity. Some Irish adopted Norse customs and dress. A hybrid culture emerged, particularly in and around the coastal towns, where Norse and Gael blended into something new. The Irish kings, meanwhile, adapted their strategies. They learned that the Vikings could be fought, could be defeated if caught in the right circumstances. In 902, the High King Flann Sinna successfully expelled the Vikings from Dublin, forcing them to abandon the town for more than a decade. When they returned in 917, it was as merchants more than raiders, though they retained their military capabilities. Kings also learned that Vikings could be useful. They hired Norse mercenaries to fight in their endless wars with rival Irish kingdoms. They formed alliances with Viking leaders, sometimes marrying their daughters to Norse chieftains to cement the bonds. The political landscape became even more fragmented and complex than it had been before, with Norse Gael dynasties competing for power alongside purely Irish lineages. The most famous confrontation between Irish and Viking came at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian Boru, who had risen from relatively obscure origins to become High King of Ireland through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and ruthless ambition, faced a coalition of rebellious Irish kings and their Viking allies from Dublin, Orkney, and the Isle of Man. The battle was fought on Good Friday just north of Dublin, and it was brutal. According to the later chronicles, which certainly exaggerate, thousands died. Brian Boru was now elderly, too old to fight in the front lines, and while his forces won the battle, he was killed in his tent by fleeing Vikings who stumbled upon him. His death marked the end of the closest Ireland had yet come to political unity. The High Kingship fragmented again, and the island returned to its customary pattern of competing regional powers. But Clontarf was not the end of the Viking presence in Ireland. The Norse Gael towns continued to thrive. Dublin, under its Norse kings, remained a powerful force in Irish politics for another century and a half. The Vikings had become Irish, or the Irish had become Viking, depending on how you looked at it. The DNA evidence tells the story. Modern Irish people, especially in coastal areas, carry Norse genetic markers in significant proportions. The cultural fusion was real and lasting. The Vikings also left linguistic traces. Irish absorbed Norse words for trade and seafaring, for urban life and commerce, areas where the Irish had little vocabulary because they had little experience. The Norse, in turn, adopted Irish naming patterns, Irish legal customs, Irish artistic styles. The intricate interlaced patterns that characterize Viking Age art in Ireland show clear influence from Irish monastic manuscripts, suggesting that Norse craftsmen were learning from and adapting Irish techniques. By the time the Viking Age formally ended in the 11th century, as Scandinavia converted to Christianity and the raiding culture gave way to more settled kingdoms, Ireland had been transformed. It now had towns. It had international trade connections. It had a more complex economy. And it had a population that was genetically, culturally, and politically more diverse than ever before. The Vikings had not conquered Ireland. They were too few, and Ireland too fragmented for that. But they had changed it profoundly. And they had also made it visible to the wider world, establishing trade routes and political connections that would, in time, attract the attention of new powers. From England, from Normandy, new conquerors would look westward across the Irish Sea and see opportunity. In 1169, a deposed Irish king named Dermot MacMurrough made a decision that would alter Ireland's history for the next 8.5 centuries. Driven from his kingdom of Leinster by his rivals, desperate to regain his throne, Dermot crossed to England and sought the help of Henry II, the Angevin king who ruled not just England, but vast territories in France as well. Henry was too busy to invade Ireland himself, but he gave Dermot permission to recruit help among the Norman Welsh lords of the frontier regions, men hungry for land and glory. Dermot found his champion in Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, a minor earl who saw in Ireland an opportunity to rebuild his fortunes. In 1170, Strongbow landed in Waterford with an army of knights and archers, captured the town, married Dermot's daughter, and set about conquering Leinster. The Irish kingdoms, divided and often at war with each other, could not mount a unified resistance. Within 2 years, Dermot was dead, and Strongbow had claimed Leinster as his own. Henry, alarmed that one of his vassals was carving out an independent kingdom in Ireland, crossed over himself in 1171 with a much larger army. His goal was not to conquer all of Ireland, that would come later, but to assert his overlordship, to make clear that any Norman gains in Ireland were held from him. He succeeded. The Norman lords acknowledged him as their superior. Many Irish kings, recognizing his power, submitted and paid tribute. The Pope, through a controversial document called the Laudabiliter, had already granted Henry lordship of Ireland, part of the Church's ongoing efforts to bring the Irish Church more fully under Roman control. What followed was not a single conquest, but centuries of expansion, contraction, and stalemate. The Normans built castles, introduced feudalism, established towns and courts, but they never conquered all of Ireland. The native Irish kingdoms, particularly in the north and west, maintained their independence, adapting to the new military realities, sometimes forming alliances with Norman lords against other Irish kings. A complex frontier zone emerged called the Pale, the area around Dublin where English law prevailed, beyond which lay the wild Irish, and increasingly the degenerate English, those Norman families who had adopted Irish language, dress, and customs, becoming, as the saying went, more Irish than the Irish themselves. The English crown tried repeatedly to impose order, sending over armies, passing laws like the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, which forbade the English from speaking Irish, wearing Irish clothing, or marrying Irish people. These laws were largely ignored. Ireland remained divided, a patchwork of competing powers, neither fully conquered nor fully independent. Then came the Reformation. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s, he declared himself head of the Church in Ireland as well as in England, but the Irish people, by and large, remained Catholic. This religious divide would deepen over the following centuries, becoming entangled with political and ethnic identities in ways that proved toxic and enduring. The English response to Irish resistance in the 16th century was brutal. The Tudor Reconquest, as it's known, was a sustained military campaign to bring all of Ireland under direct crown control. Entire regions were devastated. The province of Munster, which had resisted fiercely, was described by English observers as virtually empty after the wars, its population dead from violence, starvation, or disease. The lands thus cleared were confiscated and granted to English settlers in what were called plantations. The most extensive of these was the plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s. Lands confiscated from rebellious Gaelic lords and the Church were divided among English and Scottish Protestant settlers. Entire communities were transplanted, creating in Ulster a Protestant majority that would define the region's troubled future. The native Catholic population was displaced to poorer land, or reduced to the status of tenants on estates now owned by foreign landlords. These plantations sowed the seeds for centuries of conflict. By the mid-1600s, Ireland was a tinderbox. In 1641, the Irish rebelled, massacring Protestant settlers in Ulster. What followed was 10 years of chaotic warfare involving Irish Catholics, Irish Protestants, English Royalists, and English parliamentarians, all fighting in shifting alliances. Oliver Cromwell's campaign in 1649 to 1650 was particularly savage. Towns that resisted were sacked, garrisons massacred, populations driven westward. To hell or to Connaught was Cromwell's supposed ultimatum, offering Catholics the choice of exile to the poorest province or death. Thousands chose exile. The Williamite War of 1688 to 1691 When Catholic King James II fought Protestant King William of Orange for the English throne, saw Ireland once again become a battlefield. William's victory at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 is still commemorated by Protestants in Northern Ireland, while Catholics remember it as the consolidation of their defeat and dispossession. That defeat was enshrined in law through the penal laws, a comprehensive legal code designed to exclude Catholics from political power, land ownership, education, and many professions. Catholics could not vote, could not sit in Parliament, could not own a horse worth more than £5, could not send their children abroad for education, could not practice law. Mass was celebrated in secret at remote locations. Mass rocks hidden in the hills. Priests were hunted. Education was illegal, conducted in hedge schools where teachers moved from place to place, teaching Latin and Irish literature and mathematics in the open air. The penal laws were never fully enforced. They would have required a police state Ireland didn't have. But their existence degraded Catholic life, stunted opportunity, and deepened resentment. By the late 1700s, Catholic Ireland was impoverished, resentful, and ripe for rebellion. The United Irishmen, inspired by the French and American revolutions, rose in 1798, attempting to overthrow British rule and establish an Irish republic. The rebellion was crushed with great loss of life, and in its aftermath, the British government abolished the Irish Parliament entirely through the Act of Union in 1800, making Ireland part of the United Kingdom, governed directly from Westminster. And then came the catastrophe that would define Irish consciousness for generations, the Great Famine. In 1845, a fungal disease, Phytophthora infestans, appeared in Irish potato fields. The potato, introduced from South America centuries earlier, had become the staple food for the majority of Irish people, particularly the poor. A single acre could produce enough potatoes to feed a family for a year, allowing population growth on increasingly subdivided plots of land. By 1845, Ireland's population had reached over 8 million, the majority dependent on this single crop. The blight destroyed the potato harvest. The first year, people hoped it was a temporary crisis, a bad season that would pass. But the blight returned in 1846, worse than before, and again in 1847 and 1848, and on into 1849. The potatoes rotted in the ground, turning to black slime within days of being dug up, unusable, inedible, releasing a stench that haunted those who lived through it for the rest of their lives. Fields that should have been green with potato plants stood empty or filled with blackened, stinking vegetation. The main food source for millions of people simply disappeared. Famine swept the island with a horror that is almost impossible to convey to those who have never experienced chill hunger. It was not merely being hungry, not merely missing a meal or two. It was systematic starvation, watching your body consume itself, watching your children's bellies swell with hunger edema while their limbs became stick-thin, watching the light fade from their eyes as malnutrition sapped their strength and made them vulnerable to every disease. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, cholera, all swept through communities already weakened by hunger, killing people who might have survived the disease if they had been properly nourished. The roads filled with people searching for food, for work, for anything that might keep them alive another day. They abandoned their homes because there was no longer any point in staying. The land had betrayed them, and they were moving toward the workhouses, toward the soup kitchens when they finally opened, toward the ports where emigrant ships waited, toward anywhere but the emptiness of their devastated villages. Contemporary accounts describe walking skeletons, people so emaciated that their bones showed through their skin. people lying in ditches too weak to move, people dying with their mouths stained green because they had been eating grass and nettles in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. The workhouses, established under the poor law system to provide relief for the destitute, were quickly overwhelmed. They were designed to house perhaps a few hundred people in each union. Suddenly, thousands were appearing at their gates, begging for admission, for food, for shelter. The conditions inside became nightmarish. People were packed together in rooms designed for far fewer occupants. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Many who entered the workhouses never left, dying of fever or starvation, despite the meager assistance provided. The workhouses became charnel houses, places of death as much as relief. The British government's response was catastrophic, guided by laissez-faire economic ideology and racist assumptions about the Irish character. They refused to interfere significantly with the market, refused to close Irish ports to food exports, even as people starved in sight of the ships carrying Irish-grown wheat and oats to England. Massive quantities of food were being produced in Ireland throughout the famine years, but it belonged to landlords and merchants who sold it to whoever would pay, and starving peasants had no money. Ships laden with grains sailed from Cork and Limerick, while people in the surrounding countryside died of hunger. The government established public works schemes, making starving people build roads to nowhere. Roads that often led from one empty field to another, had no economic purpose, existed solely to provide employment in exchange for wages barely sufficient to buy food at inflated prices. People worked in the rain and cold, already weakened by hunger, breaking stones, moving earth for a few pence a day, then discovered that the price of meal had risen faster than their wages. They worked themselves to death, literally, collapsing on the roadside, dying with picks and shovels still in their hands. They set up soup kitchens, but too late and too limited, providing watery broth that barely kept people alive, and only after months of bureaucratic delay, while people starved. They blamed the Irish for their plight, with government officials and newspaper editorials portraying the famine as a moral failing, a consequence of Irish laziness, Irish improvidence, Irish dependence on a single crop. Some framed it in explicitly providential terms, suggesting that God was punishing the Irish for their adherence to Catholicism, or using the famine to teach them self-reliance and industry. The suffering was rationalized, minimized, blamed on its victims rather than on the structures that had made the Irish poor and vulnerable in the first place. People died by the hundreds of thousands. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but estimates suggest that about 1 million died of starvation and disease between 1845 and 1852. Another million emigrated, fleeing to America, Britain, Australia, anywhere that offered hope of survival. The population of Ireland, which had been over 8 million in 1841, had dropped to 6.5 million by 1851, and it never recovered. Today, the island of Ireland's population is still less than 7 million, the only country in Europe with a smaller population than it had nearly 2 centuries ago. The famine radicalized Irish politics. Moderate nationalism, which had hoped for reform within the Union, gave way to more radical visions. The Fenians, a secret revolutionary society, began planning armed rebellion. The land war of the 1870s and 80s saw tenant farmers organizing against their landlords, demanding fair rents and security of tenure, sometimes using boycotts and violence. The Home Rule movement grew in strength, demanding an Irish parliament restored. But each time Home Rule seemed close to achievement, obstacles appeared. Ulster Protestants, descendants of the planters, feared being a minority in a Catholic-dominated Ireland, and organised to resist. "Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right," they declared, raising a private army and threatening civil war if Home Rule was imposed. The British Parliament, divided, kept postponing the issue. The Easter Rising of 1916, a rebellion launched by a small group of Republicans while Britain was distracted by World War I, was militarily futile but politically transformative. The rebels seized the General Post Office in Dublin and proclaimed an Irish Republic. They were crushed within a week. But the British response, executing the leaders one by one over several days, turned them into martyrs. Public opinion, which had been largely hostile to the rebels, shifted. The War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, was a brutal guerrilla conflict between the Irish Republican Army and British forces. Ambushes, reprisals, assassinations, and executions marked a vicious cycle of violence. It ended in a treaty that partitioned Ireland. 26 counties became the Irish Free State, later the Republic of Ireland, independent, but within the British Commonwealth. 6 counties in Ulster, with their Protestant majority, remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. The partition satisfied almost no one. It led immediately to a civil war in the south between those who accepted the treaty and those who rejected it as a betrayal. Northern Ireland, meanwhile, became a statelet where the Protestant majority controlled the government and systematically discriminated against the Catholic minority in housing, employment, and voting rights. This discrimination eventually sparked the Troubles, beginning in the late 1960s and lasting 30 years. What started as a civil rights movement demanding equality for Catholics in Northern Ireland, inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, and marching peacefully for basic rights like fair housing allocation and one person, one vote in local elections, escalated into a complex, brutal conflict involving Republican paramilitaries fighting for Irish reunification, Loyalist paramilitaries fighting to remain British, the British Army trying to maintain order, and politicians on all sides struggling to find a path to peace. The trigger was a series of peaceful protests in 1968 and 1969 that were met with violence from Loyalist counter-protesters and sometimes from the police themselves. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, Northern Ireland's police force, was overwhelmingly Protestant and was seen by many Catholics as a sectarian force rather than an impartial enforcer of law. When peaceful marchers were beaten by police batons, when residents of Catholic neighborhoods were attacked by Loyalist mobs, while police stood by or even participated, the situation radicalized rapidly. The British Army was deployed to Northern Ireland in August 1969, initially welcomed by many Catholics as protection against Loyalist attacks. But the Army's role quickly shifted from peacekeeping to counterinsurgency as the Provisional Irish Republican Army, a group that had split from the older official IRA, began a campaign of violence aimed at forcing British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. The Provisional IRA, or Provos as they were often called, saw themselves as continuing the Republican tradition stretching back to the Easter Rising, fighting a war of national liberation against British occupation. Their tactics included bombings of commercial and military targets, assassinations of police officers and soldiers, punishment beatings and shootings of alleged criminals or informers within their own communities, and sporadic attacks that kept Northern Ireland in a state of perpetual tension. Loyalist paramilitaries, groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Defence Association, responded with their own campaign of violence, primarily targeting Catholics, often at random, attempting to terrorize the Catholic community into abandoning support for republicanism. the violence reached a peak in 1972, a year that saw nearly 500 deaths. Bloody Sunday, January 30th, 1972, when British paratroopers shot and killed 13 unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry, became a defining moment, radicalizing a generation of young Catholics and providing the IRA with a flood of new recruits. The bombing campaign intensified, with explosions in city centres, pubs, train stations, anywhere that might cause casualties and economic damage. The British government responded with internment without trial, security sweeps, and an increasingly militarized approach that often treated entire Catholic neighborhoods as enemy territory. Over 3,600 people died in the violence between the late 1960s and 1998. Soldiers and police officers, IRA and loyalist paramilitaries, but also, heartbreakingly, civilians, people who happened to be in the wrong place when a bomb went off. People killed because they were Catholic or Protestant, or simply because they lived on the wrong street in a divided city. Children died, teenagers died, mothers and fathers died. The violence was intimate and horrifying, neighbors killing neighbors, communities traumatized generation after generation, a toll made all the more tragic by the small geographic area and population involved. Northern Ireland's population was only about 1.5 million people. Almost everyone knew someone who had been killed or injured, who had lost a family member, who carried the scars, physical or psychological, of the conflict. Peace came slowly, painfully, through years of negotiation, secret talks, false starts, and renewed violence. The process involved politicians from all sides: Republican, nationalist, unionist, loyalist, British, Irish. It involved paramilitaries, some of whom were willing to contemplate a political path forward, others of whom rejected any compromise. It involved community leaders, church figures, ordinary people exhausted by decades of violence who simply wanted it to stop. Secret back-channel communications established tentative trust. Ceasefires were declared, broken, declared again. The violence sputtered and flared unpredictably through the early 1990s. The breakthrough came through a combination of factors. Paramilitary leaders, particularly within the IRA, recognized that they could not achieve their goals through violence alone, that military stalemate was the reality, and that a political path might achieve more. The British and Irish governments, working together more closely than ever before, provided frameworks for negotiation. International pressure and assistance, particularly from the United States, helped broker agreements and maintain momentum when talks seemed ready to collapse. And crucially, both communities in Northern Ireland were exhausted, ready for an alternative to the endless cycle of violence and retaliation. The Good Friday Agreement, signed on April 10, 1998, after marathon negotiations that pushed right up to the deadline, established a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland, ensuring that both the unionist and nationalist communities would have representation in the governing executive. It recognized the principle that Northern Ireland's constitutional status, whether to remain part of the United Kingdom or to join the Republic of Ireland, could only change by majority vote of the people of Northern Ireland, acknowledging both the legitimacy of the current status and the possibility of future change. It acknowledged the validity of both British and Irish identities in the North, allowing people to identify as British or Irish or both, and to hold citizenship in either or both countries. It established bodies for North-South cooperation on matters of common interest and for cooperation between the British and Irish governments. And crucially, it linked progress on political structures to the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons and the reform of policing and justice systems to make them more representative and accountable. It wasn't perfect. Implementation was rocky, with the power-sharing executive collapsing multiple times over disputes about weapons decommissioning, about policing, about flags and parades, and the symbolic issues that carried such weight in Northern Ireland's divided society. Hardline elements on both sides rejected the agreement, with dissident Republican groups continuing sporadic violence for years afterward. But the major paramilitary organizations, Republican and Loyalist, largely stuck to their ceasefires. The violence stopped, or at least dropped, to levels so low that they no longer defined daily life. The security barriers that had divided Belfast came down. The checkpoints that had dotted rural roads disappeared. People could move freely without fear of being caught in the crossfire. And that itself was a kind of miracle, a transformation so profound that those who had lived through the worst of the Troubles sometimes struggled to believe it was real. Ireland today is a changed place. The Republic is prosperous, one of Europe's economic success stories, though not without its problems of inequality and housing crises and the challenges that come with rapid economic development. It's cosmopolitan, with Dublin particularly becoming an international city, home to European headquarters of major tech companies, attracting immigrants from across the world, a far cry from the isolated, economically stagnant nation it was through much of the 20th century. It's increasingly secular, with the Catholic Church's once dominant role in Irish life dramatically diminished, following scandals and changing social attitudes, with laws on divorce, same-sex marriage, and abortion liberalized in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Northern Ireland, while still marked by division, with separate schools for Protestant and Catholic children, with neighborhoods still largely segregated by religion, with political parties still organized primarily along sectarian lines, is largely at peace. The peace walls that divide Belfast neighborhoods haven't all come down, but they're increasingly seen as relics rather than necessities. Young people who have grown up since the Good Friday Agreement have different expectations, different assumptions about what's possible, less willing to accept the old divisions as inevitable or natural. The Troubles are history for them, something their parents and grandparents lived through, not their own experience. That generational shift, more than any political structure, may be what finally allows Northern Ireland to move fully beyond its violent past. The memory of famine, of oppression, of partition, of the Troubles, these haven't faded. They're taught in schools, commemorated in museums, debated in parliaments. They shape political discourse, inform identity, influence how people understand themselves and their relationship to their neighbors and to the wider world. The famine in particular remains a defining trauma, remembered not just as a natural disaster, but as a failure of policy and compassion, as evidence that Ireland's relationship with Britain was fundamentally colonial and exploitative. The Great Hunger, as it's often called, is central to Irish identity in ways that are hard for outsiders to fully understand. But these memories no longer define the present in the way they once did. Ireland has moved on while still carrying its history, a difficult balance but one that seems, for now at least, to be working. The island has endured, has survived, has in many ways flourished despite everything history threw at it. From the hunters who first crossed into a post-glacial wilderness 8,000 years ago, to the farmers who cleared the great forests, to the builders who aligned monuments to the solstice, to the warriors and kings of the Celtic world, to the monks who preserved learning through dark ages, to the people who suffered through conquest and famine, to those who fought for independence and peace. Ireland's story is one of persistence, of adaptation, of survival against odds that often seemed insurmountable. But the long memory remains. Walk through Dublin, through Belfast, through the small towns and villages scattered across the countryside, and the past is always present. In the names on the shop fronts, Irish and English side by side. In the monuments to famine victims, to executed rebels, to fallen soldiers. In the accents that shift from county to county, carrying echoes of Viking, Norman, Scots, and Gaelic. In the ruins of monasteries and the walls of British forts. In the songs sung in pubs and the stories told around tables. Ireland's history is not dead. It is living memory, contested and cherished, painful and proud, a story still being written. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The story of an island of ice and stone, of druids and saints, of conquest and famine, of struggle and endurance. Ireland's history is vast and complex, full of trauma and resilience, a reminder that the past never truly passes. It just changes shape, folding into the present, shaping the future. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through Ireland's long memory, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it lets me know you want more stories like this. Until next time, sleep well and good night.